Get out. You don't belong in my house." The words hit Grace Dawson before she had taken 3 steps into the ballroom. They came from the mouth of a man standing near the fireplace, silver-haired, tall, immaculate in a charcoal suit that cost more than most people's cars, and they were aimed at her with the casual precision of someone who had spent 63 years deciding who belonged in rooms and who did not. His name was Richard Ashford. He was the founder and chairman of Ashford Industries, a defense and energy conglomerate valued at $11 billion. This was his house. These were his guests. And the woman in the plain gray dress and flat shoes who had just walked through his front door on the arm of his only son was, in his estimation, the single greatest threat to the Ashford name since the family's founding. "I'm sorry, sir," Grace said. Her voice was steady, not confrontational, not submissive, steady the way a voice sounds when it belongs to a person who has been spoken to like this before and has learned that the best response is the one that gives the speaker nothing to push against. "Daniel invited me." Daniel invited trash. Richard's voice carried across the ballroom the way voices carry in rooms with marble floors and 30-foot ceilings, effortlessly, completely, reaching every ear without the speaker needing to raise his volume. "You reek of poverty. People like you crawl into places like this because you smell money." 200 guests were watching, some from behind champagne glasses, some from behind their phones. A senator near the bar pretended to check his watch. A hedge fund manager's wife leaned toward her companion and whispered something that made them both smile. A woman in a beaded gown shook her head slowly, the practiced shake of someone who has decided to be appalled without being involved. Richard turned to his son. Daniel Ashford, 31, stood beside Grace with his hand on the small of her back and an expression that had been hardening all evening and had now set like concrete. "Choose her," Richard said, "and you're no son of mine." Daniel did not hesitate. The pause that the room expected, the flinch, the calculation, the moment where a man weighs his inheritance against his heart, did not happen. He looked at his father with the clear, settled eyes of a man who had made this decision long before it was asked of him. "I choose her." The ballroom exhaled, not with relief, with shock. Daniel Ashford, heir to $11 billion, had just chosen a woman in a $30 dress over everything his father had built. Grace placed her hand on Daniel's arm, not to steady herself, to steady him. She knew what that sentence had cost. She knew because she had watched her own father make sentences like that. Sentences that cost everything and were spoken anyway because some men measure the price of a sentence not by what it takes from them, but by what it protects. Outside, beyond the tall front windows, the long driveway curved into the dark, empty, waiting, but not for long. Minutes later, a black car rolled through the gate. The man who stepped out was about to bring this billionaire to his knees, on his own marble floor. But who he was, and how one guest could topple an empire, no one in that room had any idea. If you believe that the quietest person in any room is usually the one holding all the cards, subscribe to the Single Dad Files. This story is just getting started. 2 hours earlier, the night had looked nothing like a disaster. The Ashford estate sat above the Connecticut shoreline. All white stone and tall windows, the kind of house that was not designed to be lived in but to be looked at. The way certain buildings exist primarily as evidence that the person who owns them can afford to own something that large and that empty. The ground stretched to the cliff edge, where the Atlantic pushed against the rocks with a rhythm that sounded, if you were standing close enough, like applause that never stopped. Candlelight spilled across the marble. A string quartet tuned in the corner. 2 violins, a viola, and a cello, all hired from a conservatory in New Haven, all being paid more for this one evening than they earned in a month of teaching. 200 guests drifted through the ballroom in silken diamonds, holding champagne they barely touched, performing the annual ritual of being seen at the Ashford Autumn Gala, an invitation-only event that served as Richard Ashford's yearly demonstration that he was still the most powerful man in a room designed to contain only powerful men. Grace arrived in a plain gray dress and flat shoes. No jewelry, no designer label, no clutch with a clasp that announced its own price. She looked to everyone in that room like someone who had wandered in by mistake. A caterer's assistant, perhaps, or a friend of a friend who had misread the dress code and was about to spend the evening apologizing for it. But she did not act like a stranger. At the front door, a young server, 23, new to the catering company, hands shaking slightly from the particular nervousness of someone who is terrified of dropping something expensive in front of people who could buy the thing he dropped without checking their account balance. Fumbled a tray of champagne glasses. Crystal teetered. The tray tilted. 6 glasses began their slide toward the marble floor and the particular sound that breaking crystal makes in a room full of people who pretend not to notice. Grace caught the edge of the tray without thinking. Her hand moved the way hands move when they belong to a person who has spent years around people who need steadying, not dramatically, not heroically, just with the quiet competence of someone who sees a problem and fixes it before it becomes a performance. She steadied the tray with one hand and the server's wrist with the other. "You've got it," she whispered. "Breathe." The server exhaled like she had just saved his life. His name was Marcus. Grace knew this because she had read his name tag, which is something that almost no one at events like this does. Because reading a server's name tag requires looking at the server, and looking at the server requires acknowledging that the server is a person, and acknowledging that the server is a person makes it harder to treat them like furniture. She knew the valet's name, too. James. She asked about his night, about the drive up from Bridgeport, about whether the overtime was worth it. She knew the coat check attendant, a college student named Priya, and asked about her mother's surgery, because Grace had asked about the surgery 3 months ago at the last event, and had remembered the answer, which is what people do when they actually care about the answer and are not simply performing the act of asking. She tipped both of them more than most guests tipped all night, folding the bills into their hands with the particular discretion of someone who understands that generosity is most meaningful when it is invisible. None of them knew who she was. She liked it that way. That was the whole point. Grace had married Daniel Ashford 2 years ago. Small ceremony, no press, no announcement in the society pages. She had never told his family the truth about her own. She wanted to be loved for the woman she was, not the name behind her. So she drove a modest car, a gray Honda that she parked behind the service vehicles because she did not want to block the Bentleys and the Range Rovers and the one Rolls-Royce that belonged to a man who had inherited it and would never admit that he could not afford. The maintenance. She wore quiet clothes. She let them all assume she came from nothing. The assumption was comfortable for everyone. It confirmed what they already believed, that Daniel had married beneath him, that Grace was a project or a phase or a rebellion that would end when the novelty wore off. The assumption allowed them to be cruel without feeling guilty. Because cruelty toward people you consider inferior is not cruelty in the vocabulary of the very rich. It is correction. Daniel found her across the room and laced his fingers through hers. "You okay?" he asked. He had grown up in this house under his father's thumb, and he hated how cold it could feel. The marble, the money, the way every conversation was a transaction and every smile was a negotiation. "I'm fine," Grace said. "It's a beautiful party." "My father's in a mood," Daniel warned softly. "He's been drinking since 4. Just stay near me." She squeezed his hand. "I always do." Around them, the conversation was all money. A senator laughed too loud near the bar. The laugh of a man who needs the room to know he is having a good time. A banker bragged about a yacht with the enthusiasm of a man who needs other people to be impressed in order to feel real. 2 women in matching designer gowns discussed a charity auction in voices loud enough to ensure that everyone within 15 feet knew how generous they were planning to be. And under the music, in tight little circles, the executives whispered about something else entirely. Something worried. Ashford Industries was in trouble. Not the kind of trouble that shows up in press releases or quarterly earnings calls. The kind that lives in whispered conversations between men who know the numbers and are afraid to say them out loud. The defense contracts were drying up. 2 major bids had been lost to competitors who were younger, faster, and willing to undercut. The energy division was hemorrhaging money on a pipeline project that was 3 years behind schedule and $2 billion over budget. The stock price had dropped 14% in 6 months, and the board was asking questions that Richard Ashford was not accustomed to answering. Grace caught pieces of it as she passed, the way you catch fragments of other people's conversations at parties, not by listening, but by existing in the same space as people who have forgotten you are there. Invisible people hear everything. That is the advantage of being underestimated. 1 bad quarter from the edge, everything's riding on the new contract. If the chairman doesn't sign, we're finished. They said the word chairman like a prayer. The chairman of Maddox Global Partners, a man none of them had ever met. whose face had never appeared in a magazine, whose name was known only to the very top tier of the defense and energy industry. He had built Maddox Global from a single government contract into a sprawling defense and energy conglomerate that operated in 23 countries. He was flying in tonight. His signature on a joint venture agreement would save Ashford Industries. Without it, Richard Ashford's empire would begin to collapse under the weight of its own debt. Grace heard all of it. She didn't say a word. She just sipped her water and watched the room glitter, the way you watch a chandelier that is beautiful and heavy and hanging by a chain that is thinner than anyone wants to admit. She checked her phone once, read a message, slipped it back into her clutch. Whatever it said, it made her shoulders settle, the way shoulders settle when a person who has been bracing for something receives confirmation that the thing they are bracing for is on schedule. Near the fireplace, Richard Ashford held court. He was 63, silver-haired, square-jawed, and certain of himself in the way that only inherited wealth and unchallenged power allow. He shook hands like he was granting favors. He spoke about his company the way preachers speak about God, with absolute conviction and zero tolerance for doubt. He had the particular posture of a man who has never been told he is wrong by anyone whose opinion he valued, which meant he had never been told he was wrong at all. When his eyes passed over Grace, they went flat and cold, the way you look at a smudge on clean glass, the way you look at something that should not be there and that you intend to remove as soon as the timing is appropriate. He had decided who Grace was the moment Daniel brought her home 2 years ago. Poor. Beneath them, a mistake he intended to correct. The fact that she was black had never been spoken aloud. Richard was too polished for that, too aware of microphones and witnesses and the particular vocabulary of modern racism that requires deniability. But it lived in the flatness of his gaze, in the particular temperature of his silence when she entered a room, in the way he said, "That woman," instead of her name, as if naming her would make her real and he preferred her to remain abstract. A problem, not a person. Grace felt the look land. She had felt it many times. She just lifted her chin and let it slide off the way water slides off stone, not because the stone does not feel the water, but because the stone was there before the water arrived and will be there after it evaporates. Eleanor Ashford, Richard's wife, floated past in emerald silk. She was 59, impeccably maintained, the kind of woman whose smile required more engineering than the house she lived in. She had mastered the art of cruelty as compliment, the ability to wound someone while appearing to any observer to be making pleasant conversation. She paused near Grace long enough to deliver a sentence that was designed to cut while sounding like silk. "Such a brave little dress," Eleanor murmured, her eyes traveling down the gray fabric the way a jeweler's eyes travel down a stone that is not worth appraising. And she kept walking before Grace could respond, which was the point. The insult was a drive-by, designed to hit without stopping. A few nearby guests hid their laughter behind their glasses. Daniel's jaw tightened. Grace touched his arm. "Don't," she said gently. "Not tonight. Tonight's important." She glanced toward the tall front windows. Beyond them, the long driveway curved into darkness. Empty and waiting. She knew something the whole room didn't, and in less than 2 hours, every person holding a champagne glass would know it too. To be continued in part 2. If you've ever walked into a room and felt every eye decide who you are before you opened your mouth, you already know this story. Drop a comment. Have you ever been judged by what you were wearing instead of who you are? And subscribe to the Single Dad Files because the man in the black car is about to arrive. And what happens when he walks through that door will end Richard Ashford's world. The trouble started at the toast. Richard raised his glass at 9:15 p.m., standing on the small platform near the orchestra, bathed in the warm light of 3 crystal chandeliers that his grandfather had imported from Prague. The room gathered, glasses lifted. The string quartet held its last note and let it dissolve into expectant silence. "Thank you all for being here," Richard began, his voice carrying with the ease of a man who had been speaking to rooms full of powerful people for 4 decades. "The Ashford name has meant something in this country for 3 generations. Tonight, we celebrate what that name has built, and what it will continue to build." He paused. His eyes found Grace across the room. She was standing near the back beside Daniel, holding a glass of water while everyone around her held champagne. She was the only person in the room who was not drinking, and the only person in the room who did not need to drink to endure the evening. Of course, Richard continued, his voice shifting into the register that people use when they are about to say something cruel and want it to sound like observation. Every family faces challenges. People who arrive uninvited to the table and assume they are welcome to sit. The room stirred. Not everyone understood who he was talking about. The ones who did, the inner circle, the family friends, the executives who had heard Richard complain about Daniel's little project at private dinners, exchanged glances. Some shifted in their seats. None of them said a word because saying a word would have meant choosing a side, and choosing a side at an Ashford event was a financial decision, not a moral one. Grace did not move. She held her water glass with both hands, steady. Her face showing nothing, Daniel's hand found hers under the table. She squeezed it once, not for herself, for him, because Daniel was the one shaking, and Grace was the one who was still. Richard finished the toast with a line about legacy and strength that sounded like it had been written by a speechwriter who had been told to make ego sound like wisdom. The room applauded, the quartet resumed, and the evening continued its slow rotation toward the moment that no one in the room saw coming. It happened at 9:47 p.m. Grace was crossing the ballroom, heading toward the powder room, when Richard intercepted her. Not accidentally, deliberately, stepping into her path with the physical authority of a man who is accustomed to people moving out of his way and who has never once considered the possibility that someone might not. "We need to talk," he said. "Of course, sir. Not here." He gestured toward the library, a smaller room off the main ballroom, lined floor to ceiling with books that Richard had never read but that looked impressive through the glass doors. The kind of books that exist in rich men's houses not for reading but for photographing. In there, Grace followed. Daniel saw them move and started to follow, but Eleanor placed a hand on his arm, gently the way a mother restrains a child she has been conditioning to obey since birth, and whispered, "Let your father handle this. It's for the best." The library door closed. Through the glass, the party continued. Music, laughter, the clink of glasses, the performance of pleasure. Inside the library, the air was different. The air was a negotiation. Richard did not sit. He stood behind his desk, a desk that was positioned on a slightly raised platform, a detail that most visitors did not notice but that had been designed specifically to make the person sitting across from him feel physically lower. Architecture as intimidation. The silent language of men who need every room to confirm their superiority. Grace did not sit either. She stood in front of the desk with her hands at her sides and the posture of a woman who had been in rooms like this before, not this specific room, but rooms like it. Rooms where powerful men put themselves on platforms and expected the person across from them to feel small. "I'll be direct," Richard said. "I want you out of my son's life." "I understand that, sir. I'm prepared to offer you $200,000 to walk away tonight. Clean, quiet, no lawyers, you sign a non-disclosure agreement, you leave Connecticut, and you never contact Daniel or any member of this family again." Grace looked at him. At the desk, at the books he had never read, at the raised platform. "No, thank you," she said. Richard's jaw tightened. He was not a man who heard no. He was a man who heard not yet, and increased the number until the not yet became a yes. That was how he had built his company. That was how he had built his marriage. That was how he had built his life, by treating every person as a price point and every relationship as a transaction. 500,000. No. $1 million, Grace. $1 million to walk away from a marriage that you entered for financial gain. I didn't marry Daniel for money. Mr. Ashford, everyone marries for money. The only question is how much. Then you've been in the wrong rooms your entire life. The sentence landed in the library like a stone through the glass doors. Richard's face changed, not dramatically, but in the way that certain faces change when the person behind them realizes they have been spoken to as an equal by someone they consider inferior. It was not anger, it was something worse, confusion. The confusion of a man whose framework for understanding the world does not contain a category for a woman in flat shoes who turns down $1 million and does it without raising her voice. "Let me be clearer," Richard said. His voice was no longer the voice of a man making an offer, it was the voice of a man issuing a threat. "If you do not accept this, I will make your life very difficult. I have lawyers who specialize in making people disappear from situations they were never meant to be in." I will have your background investigated. Every corner, every closet, every parking ticket. I will find whatever you're hiding, and you are hiding something. I can smell it, and I will use it to end this marriage on terms that leave you with nothing." Grace looked at him for a long time, the kind of look that makes powerful men uncomfortable because it does not contain the fear they expect. It contained something else, not defiance, not anger, but patience. The patience of a woman who knows something the man in front of her does not and is choosing with precision when to reveal it. "You're right about one thing, Mr. Ashford," she said. "I am hiding something." She turned and walked out of the library. Richard watched her go with the expression of a man who has just been given a piece of information he does not know how to process and has decided to process it with force. What happened next took 7 minutes. 7 minutes that would replay in the memories of 200 guests for the rest of their lives. 7 minutes that would be described in depositions, in newspaper articles, in the kind of whispered conversations that replace the old whispered conversations about money with new whispered conversations about the man who used to have it. At 10:02 p.m., Richard walked out of the library and crossed the ballroom to where Grace and Daniel were standing near the windows. He did not lower his voice. He did not pull them aside. He did not make the smallest concession to privacy or decency or the basic human principle that humiliation should not be a spectator sport. He did what men like Richard do when they have decided that their power is more important than their dignity. He made it public. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice cutting through the music like a blade through silk, "I apologize for the interruption, but I believe you all deserve to know the kind of person who has entered our family." The quartet stopped. The room turned. 200 faces swiveled toward the sound with the synchronized precision of an audience that has been waiting, without knowing it was waiting, for something to happen. "This woman," he pointed at Grace with the hand that was holding his champagne glass, "the way you point at something you are about to discard, married my son under false pretenses. She came from nothing. She brought nothing. She is nothing. She is a parasite who attached herself to the Ashford name because she could not build one of her own." The words fell on the room like hammer blows, each one deliberate, each one aimed, each one designed to do maximum damage to a woman who was standing 12 feet away holding a glass of water, wearing a $30 dress, and showing absolutely nothing on her face. Grace stood motionless. Her hands were at her sides. Her face showed nothing. Not anger, not hurt, not the satisfaction of a woman who knows something the speaker does not. Just stillness. The kind of stillness that belongs to a person who has decided that the person speaking is not worth the energy of a response. Daniel stepped forward. "Father, stop. I will not stop. I have tolerated this long enough." Richard turned back to Grace. "I offered you $1 million to leave quietly. You refused. So now the room will know what I know, that you are a fraud, a gold digger, and a stain on this family." He turned to the head of a security team, a large man in a dark suit standing near the service entrance. "Briggs, search her." The word search moved through the room like an electric current. Gasps. Not collective. Individual, scattered, each one representing a person who had just witnessed something cross a line they did not know existed until it was crossed. A woman near the bar covered her mouth. A man in a tuxedo turned to his wife and said very quietly, "This is wrong." His wife pulled his arm and said, even more quietly, "Don't get involved." "Search her bag, her pockets, everything. I want to know what she's carrying. People like her always carry something that doesn't belong to them." "Mr. Ashford," Briggs began. "Now." Briggs hesitated. He was a professional, 20 years in private security, a man who understood that following orders is not the same as following the law, and that the space between the two is where careers end. He looked at Grace. He looked at the 200 phones that had appeared in 200 hands, recording everything with the passive hunger of a generation that documents cruelty but does not interrupt it. Grace made the decision for him. She opened her clutch herself. She turned it upside down and let the contents fall onto the nearest table with a sound that was quiet but that carried across the silent ballroom like a verdict. A phone with a cracked screen protector, a drugstore lipstick, a $20 bill folded twice, a house key on a plain ring, and a photograph that landed face up on the white tablecloth. "There," she said, "that's everything I'm carrying." The photograph showed a man holding a little girl on his lap. The man was smiling, not performing a smile, not posing, just smiling the way people smile when they are holding someone they love and have forgotten that a camera exists. The girl was maybe 4 or 5, laughing, her small hand gripping his collar. The man was black, broad-shouldered, wearing a simple white shirt, and looking at the camera with the expression of a father who knows that the child in his arms is the most important thing he will ever hold and does not need anyone in any room to confirm it. Richard looked at the photograph the way you look at evidence that does not support your theory, with irritation, then dismissal. Sentimental. I expected a stolen credit card, perhaps the Ashford crest is too much to hope for. He turned away. He had made his show. He had humiliated her in front of 200 people. He had offered money and been refused. He had ordered a search and found nothing. In his mind, the matter was settled. Grace was exposed, Daniel was warned, and the room had been reminded who owned it. He was about to learn that he owned nothing. At 10:09 p.m., the front gate intercom buzzed. "Sir, there's a vehicle at the gate. Black sedan. Government plates." Richard frowned. "I wasn't expecting anyone from Washington tonight. The driver says he's bringing a guest. Says the guest's name is Maddox." The blood left Richard's face in stages. First the cheeks, then the forehead, then the lips. The name Maddox moved through his body the way cold water moves through pipes. Fast, everywhere, impossible to stop. Maddox. The chairman. The man whose signature would save Ashford Industries. The man Richard had been courting for 2 years through intermediaries and lawyers and carefully worded letters that never received personal replies. "Open the gate," Richard said. "Immediately, and someone get me a fresh glass of champagne." He straightened his suit. He adjusted his tie. He crossed the ballroom at a pace that was carefully calibrated to look unhurried, but that covered ground faster than a walk. He positioned himself at the front door, the grand entrance, not the side entrance, not the service entrance. And he waited with the particular posture of a man who is about to meet someone more powerful than himself and has not had to practice that posture in a very long time. The black sedan pulled up the circular drive. Its headlights swept across the white stone facade and the tall windows and the 200 faces that were now pressing toward the glass to see who had arrived in a car with government plates at 10 o'clock at night. A driver in a dark suit stepped out and opened the rear door. A man stepped out. He was 56 years old. Broad-shouldered, he wore a dark navy suit, well-made but not flashy. The kind of suit that does not need a label because the man inside it does not need a label. He had close-cropped gray hair and hands that were large and calm, and carried the quiet authority of a man who had built everything he owned from nothing, and had never forgotten what nothing felt like. He had raised a daughter alone since she was 4 years old. He had cooked her dinner every night. He had read her bedtime stories until she fell asleep. He had driven her to school every morning and picked her up every afternoon and sat at the kitchen table every evening helping with homework, while simultaneously running a company that operated in 23 countries and employed 41,000 people. He had done all of this without a wife, without a partner, without a nanny, without ever once asking someone else to carry what he considered his privilege to carry. He stood in the driveway and looked up at the Ashford estate with the expression of a man who has seen many large houses and is not impressed by any of them because he knows that the size of a house tells you nothing about the size of the people inside it. Then he looked at the front door, where Richard Ashford was standing with an outstretched hand and a smile that was working harder than it had ever worked in its life. "Mr. Maddox?" Richard said. "It is an honor, an absolute honor. We've been expecting you." The man shook Richard's hand. Brief, firm. "Thank you for having me, Mr. Ashford. Please call me Richard." Come in, come in." They walked through the front door into the foyer and toward the ballroom. Richard was talking fast, eager, the verbal equivalent of a man laying red carpet as he walked. The executives who had been whispering about the chairman all evening straightened their ties and adjusted their smiles and prepared the handshakes they had been rehearsing in bathroom mirrors. The man who had stepped out of the black sedan walked through the ballroom with the unhurried stride of a person who is accustomed to being in rooms where he is the most important person present, and who does not enjoy it but does not avoid it either. He was scanning the room, not the way Richard scanned it, looking for threats, looking for leverage, looking for the hierarchy. He was scanning it the way a father scans a schoolyard at pickup time, looking for one person, the only person who matters. He found her. Grace was standing near the back windows, Daniel beside her, her clutch still open on the table, the photograph still face up on the white tablecloth. Her gray dress, Her flat shoes, her steady hands, her chin still lifted. Their eyes met across the ballroom, across 30 feet of marble and crystal and champagne and the collective wealth of 200 people who had spent the evening deciding that she was worth nothing. And for the first time all evening, Grace Dawson smiled. To be continued in part 3 if you just realized who the man in the black car is, and what that means for Richard Ashford. Hit that like button now. Part 3 is where the billionaire discovers that the woman he called trash, the woman he offered $1 million to disappear, the woman he searched in front of 200 people, is the daughter of the one man on earth who holds his entire empire in his hands. Subscribe to the Single Dad Files. What comes next will leave you speechless. The man walked toward Grace, not toward Richard, not toward the board members who were already standing, already extending hands, already composing the sentences they had been rehearsing for months. He walked past all of them, past the senator, past the hedge fund manager, past Eleanor in her emerald silk, past every person who had spent the evening looking through Grace like she was made of glass, and he stopped in front of the woman in the gray dress. He looked at her, she looked at him. 3 seconds of silence that 200 people would remember for the rest of their lives. Then he opened his arms, and Grace stepped into them. And the hug that followed was not a business greeting, not a social gesture, not the careful embrace of two people performing affection for an audience. It was the hug of a father and a daughter who have loved each other without condition for 29 years. And it carried the weight of every bedtime story and every school pickup, and every Sunday dinner and every phone call that ended with, "I love you, Dad," and "I love you more, baby girl." "Hi, Daddy," Grace said, her voice muffled against his shoulder. "Hi, sweetheart," the man said. "You okay?" "I am now." Richard Ashford was standing 6 feet away. His outstretched hand was still extended. His smile was still on his face, but it was no longer functioning. It was frozen there. A relic of a gesture that had been interrupted by a piece of information his brain was not yet equipped to process. The man turned to face Richard. He kept one arm around Grace's shoulders, the way fathers keep their arms around their daughters when they are standing in rooms that have not been kind. "Mr. Ashford," he said, "I believe you've met my daughter." The sentence traveled through the ballroom at the speed of understanding, which is slower than the speed of sound but far more devastating. It moved from person to person, table to table, each recipient processing it in real time. The chairman of Maddox Global Partners, the man whose signature was worth $2 billion to Ashford Industries, the man that Richard had been courting for 2 years with letters and lawyers and carefully staged desperation, was the father of the woman that Richard had just called trash. The father, the black single father who had raised her alone since she was 4. Who had built a global empire while packing school lunches and checking homework and attending dance recitals and sitting in the front row of every graduation with a camera in one hand and tears on his face, who had never remarried because no evening was worth missing dinner with his daughter, and no woman was worth introducing into his daughter's life unless she was extraordinary, and extraordinary had not arrived, so he had remained alone and complete. A father and a CEO and a man who proved every single day that those two titles were not in conflict. Richard's hand dropped. His smile collapsed. His face went through 4 expressions in 3 seconds: confusion, disbelief, calculation, and finally the expression that has no name, the one that appears on the face of a man who realizes, in front of everyone he has ever needed to impress, that he has destroyed himself. That's not. Richard's voice had lost its authority. It sounded like a machine running on its last fuel, sputtering, trying to maintain a rhythm it could no longer sustain. "There must be some misunderstanding, Mr. Maddox. I had no idea that you were—" "You had no idea," Arthur Maddox repeated, not as a question, as a diagnosis. "You had no idea that the woman you called a parasite, the woman you offered $1 million to disappear, the woman you ordered searched in front of 200 people and accused of being a thief, was my child." He said the word child the way certain men say certain words, with a weight that makes the word sound larger than the letters it contains. A word that carried 4 a.m. feedings and first steps and skinned knees and college applications, and the 25 years of single fatherhood that had produced the woman standing beside him in a $30 dress with more dignity than every person in that room combined. "Mr. Maddox, Arthur, if you had known." Arthur looked at Richard with the steady, unblinking gaze of a man who has spent 30 years in rooms like this and has never once been intimidated by the men who own them. If you had known who her father was, you would have treated her differently. That's what you're telling me. Of course, that is exactly the problem, Mr. Ashford. The ballroom was silent. 200 people, frozen. The string quartet had stopped. The servers had stopped. The ice in the champagne buckets had stopped. Even the Atlantic, crashing against the cliffs outside, seemed to pause. You would have treated her with respect if you had known she was valuable to you. But you didn't know, so you treated her like garbage. Which means your respect is not respect at all, it's a transaction. You sell it to the people who can help you, and you withhold it from the people who can't. Arthur looked around the room, at the guests who had whispered, at the senator who had looked away, at Eleanor, who was standing near the fireplace with her champagne glass frozen at chest height, and her emerald silk catching the candlelight like an irony that had dressed itself for the occasion. "My daughter," Arthur said, and his voice carried the way Richard's had carried an hour ago, except that Arthur's voice did not need marble floors and 30-foot ceilings to travel. It carried because the room was listening, and the room was listening because the man speaking had earned the right to be heard in a way that Richard had only ever purchased. "My daughter walked into this room tonight in a gray dress and flat shoes. We'll, and we'll find out. We'll just have a savior. We'll just get my friend away with the house and be wearing out. We'll just," she tipped your valet. She knew your coat check girl's name. She caught a server's tray before it fell and told him to breathe. She has been kinder to the people who work for you in one evening than you have been in 30 years of employing them. He paused, not for effect, for breath, for the weight of what he was about to say. She could have walked in here wearing a dress that cost more than your chandeliers. She could have arrived in a car that made your Mercedes look like a rental. She could have introduced herself as Grace Maddox, daughter of the chairman of Maddox Global Partners, and every person in this room would have fought for the privilege of standing near her. He looked at Grace. She was standing beside him, her hand on his arm, her face calm, her gray dress catching the candlelight. But she didn't do any of that, because she wanted to know, needed to know, whether the people in this room would treat her like a human being when they had no reason to gain from it. And you gave her the answer, Mr. Ashford, loudly, publicly, in front of every person who matters to you. Richard opened his mouth. No sound came out. He was doing the math, not financial math, not the math of contracts and leverage and quarterly projections, but the other math, the calculation that tells you how much you have just lost, and whether any of it can be recovered. The answer was no. Arthur Maddox reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a leather folder. Inside was the joint venture agreement, the document that would save Ashford Industries, the document that 200 guests had been whispering about all evening like a prayer that might not be answered. He placed it on the nearest table next to Grace's clutch, next to the photograph of a man holding a little girl on his lap. "This is the agreement your board has been negotiating for," Arthur said. $2 billion in joint venture capital, access to my defense contracts, my energy portfolio, my distribution network. Everything your company needs to survive. Richard's eyes went to the folder the way a drowning man's eyes go to a rope, the way a man who has been falling watches the ground approach. "I was going to sign it tonight," Arthur said. "I flew here to sign it. My legal team approved it. My board approved it. Everything was ready." He looked at Grace, then at Richard, then at the folder on the table. "But I will not do business with a man who treats my daughter the way you treated her tonight. I will not put my name beside the name of a man who measures human beings by the price of their clothing and the color of their skin. And I will not sign a document that would give you the resources to continue building an empire on the foundation of cruelty that I watched you demonstrate this evening." He picked up the folder. He placed it back inside his jacket. "The deal is off, Mr. Ashford. Maddox Global Partners will be pursuing other opportunities. I suggest you do the same, though I suspect your options have just become considerably narrower." Richard swayed, the small, involuntary shift in balance that happens when a man who has been standing on $11 billion discovers that the ground beneath him has just been removed. "Arthur," Richard whispered, "please. The company, my employees, thousands of people depend on. They depend on you, Mr. Ashford, and you just showed them, showed all of them, exactly who you are. The man they depend on is the man who searched a woman's purse in front of 200 people because she was wearing flat shoes and a gray dress. That is who they depend on. I suggest they start looking for alternatives." Arthur turned to Daniel. The young man was standing beside Grace, his hand on the small of her back, his face showing the complex mixture of vindication and grief that sons feel when their fathers are publicly revealed to be exactly what they always feared. "Daniel," Arthur said, extending his hand, "my daughter chose well." Daniel shook his hand. "Thank you, sir. Take care of her. I have been, sir. Since the day we met." Arthur nodded, the nod of a father who has evaluated a man and found him adequate, not perfect, not exceptional, but adequate, which in the vocabulary of fathers who raise daughters alone is the highest compliment available, because it means I trust you with the only thing I have ever built that matters. Arthur Maddox left the Ashford estate at 10:41 p.m. He did not stay for dessert. He did not tour the house. He did not compliment the chandeliers or the marble or the books that Richard had never read. He had come to do one thing, and the thing was done. He walked to the front door with Grace on one side and Daniel on the other. At the door, Grace turned back. She looked at the room, the candles, the crystal, the faces that had whispered about her dress, the woman who had called it brave, the man who had called her trash, the security guard who had searched her bag. She looked at Eleanor, who was sitting alone at a table, her emerald silk catching the candlelight, her champagne untouched, her face carrying the dawning understanding that she had spent 30 years married to a man who had just destroyed everything because he could not tolerate a woman in flat shoes. "Mrs. Ashford," Grace said, "for what it's worth, I always liked your taste in jewelry. That emerald is beautiful." "Thank you, dear," Eleanor said quietly. And for the first time that evening, it was not an insult. The black sedan was waiting. Raymond opened the door. Arthur climbed in. Grace climbed in beside him, leaning her head against his shoulder the way she had leaned against his shoulder for 29 years. On couches, in cars, at kitchen tables where he helped with homework while running a company that operated in 23 countries. At her mother's funeral when she was 4 and did not understand why mommy was sleeping in a box and why daddy was crying and why the house was so quiet afterward. "Thank you, Daddy," Grace said. "For what?" "For coming." "Baby girl, I was always coming. I was just waiting for you to tell me when." The car disappeared down the driveway. The gate closed behind it. The taillights faded into the Connecticut night like the last 2 embers of a fire that had burned down a house that took 3 generations to build. The aftermath was swift and thorough. Ashford Industries lost the Maddox deal. Without it, the debt restructuring collapsed. Within 3 months, the stock price dropped 41%. Within 6 months, the pipeline project was suspended. The defense division was sold to a competitor, and the board voted to remove Richard Ashford as chairman. The same board that had watched him humiliate Grace and had said nothing, now finding their voices only when the financial consequences made silence more expensive than speech. The estate was sold. The chandeliers were auctioned. The marble floors were walked on by new owners who did not know or care about the night that a single father in a navy suit had driven up the circular drive and brought a billionaire to his knees with 6 words. Daniel and Grace moved to a house in Virginia. Not a mansion, not an estate. Just a house with a garden and a porch, and a yellow door that Grace chose because it was the same color as the door of the apartment where Arthur had raised her alone, where he had made pancakes on Saturday mornings and braided her hair before school, and built a Fortune 500 company from the kitchen table while she did long division on the other side. Arthur visited every Sunday. He drove himself, no sedan, no driver, just a 56-year-old man in a pickup truck who parked in the driveway and walked through the yellow door without knocking. He brought dinner every time. Cooked it himself. The same meals he had cooked when Grace was 4, and the kitchen was small and the budget was smaller, and the only thing that was large was his commitment to showing up. And Richard Ashford lived quietly now, in a smaller house with a name that opened no doors. Sometimes, late at night, he would start to type an apology to Grace. He never sent one. Some part of him understood that the only apology that mattered was the one he had refused to give when it could have changed everything. When she was standing in his ballroom, calm and kind, asking only to be treated like a human being. He had a daughter-in-law worth more than his entire fortune, and he threw her away because of the color of her skin and the price of her shoes. That was the part that would haunt him. Not the money, the kindness he was offered and spat on again and again while it stood right in front of him. Never measure a person by what they are wearing. The richest soul in the room is almost never the loudest one. Sometimes it is the quiet woman in the plain dress who knows everyone's name and never once needed you to know hers. And sometimes, behind that quiet woman, there is a single father in a black sedan who raised her alone, who cooked her dinner every night, who read her bedtime stories until she fell asleep, and who will walk into a billionaire's ballroom and dismantle an empire with 6 words. I believe you've met my daughter. If this story moved you, hit that like button and share it with someone who judges too quickly or loves too quietly. Subscribe to the Single Dad Files, because every week we bring you stories where the people the world underestimates turn out to be the ones holding all the cards.